All right, we're going to now learn about multiplying and dividing integers. Remember, multiplication is repeated addition, okay? There are 4 possible situations when you multiply integers. You can get a positive times a positive, a negative times a positive, a positive times a negative, or a negative times a negative. All right, let's take each of those examples and see what happens. Well, the positive times a positive, you already know, is just going to be positive because it's like your times tables you've been doing since elementary school. 3 times 8, positive 3 times positive 8 is positive 24. Positive 9 times positive 7, positive 63. Okay, so positive times a positive is a positive. All right, the next situation, a negative times a positive. All right, let's take an example. Negative 2 times 3. Well, since, remember, multiplication is repeated addition, that means negative 2 times 3 is negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2. All right, let's take it, do order of operations. Negative 2 plus negative 2 is negative 4, because like signs add, add and keep the sign. We write down the other positive plus a negative 2. We add those together and we get a negative 6. So if we did this for every single situation you come up with a negative times a positive, the answer would always be negative. All right? So a negative times a positive is a negative. Well, if the next situation we take is positive times a negative, and we can remember, since multiplication is commutative, we can really just say that a positive times a negative is really the same thing as a negative times a positive. Because remember, commutative is when you switch, so we're switching the positions. And so if a negative times a positive was a negative, then a positive times a negative is also a negative. All right, so we've got 3 down, we've got 1 more to go. What happens when you do a negative times a negative? Well, let's consider this particular situation. If we have negative 2 times 3, which we've already done, we know that's negative 6. If we do negative 2 times 2, we know that's negative 4. We already actually saw that one. Do negative 2 times 1, that's negative 2. Negative 2 times 0 is 0. So we see a pattern. As we decrease the numbers here by 1, these decrease by 2. Or actually, they increase by 2, don't they? Negative 6, negative 4, negative 2, 0. So the next one is going to, if I here see I've added 2 each time. So what's 0 plus 2 is 2. So negative 2 times a negative 1 is 2. And what's 2 plus 2? 4. So a negative 2 times a negative 2 is 4. So we see that when we multiply a negative times a negative, it actually ends up being a positive. Okay, so 2 negatives, we could think of 2 negatives kind of canceling each other out and equaling a positive. All right, there are a couple of different ways that we can remember these, a couple little strategies you can do. You can either think it through each time like we just did, or you can memorize a tic-tac-toe, or we'll talk about the Chinese dog in just a minute. So with the tic-tac-toe, it works this way. You draw a tic-tac-toe board, and you put a plus sign down the diagonal. Okay? Once you get that plus sign down the diagonal from going down from left to right, fill in minuses with every other space available. Okay? And here, this is how you read it. If you go a positive times a negative equals a negative. A negative times a positive equals a negative. A negative times a negative equals a positive. And that's how you can remember that. So you can just write that on the top of your sheet whenever you have problems like this to do, and you'll have that as a handy-dandy way. Of course, it doesn't have a positive times a positive because we already know that a positive times a positive equals a positive. Okay? All right, the Chinese dog works like this. He's a dog and his ears say positive and division, which we'll talk about in a minute, but his eyes are negatives and his nose is a positive. So watch how this works. If I do this example, like negative 2 times a positive 7. Well, a negative 2, you simply scratch out, like you X out. I've already used up a negative. That 7 is positive, so I scratch out his positive nose. And the only thing I have left is a negative, so my answer has to be negative 14. All right, same thing if I do the next one, negative 6, I cross out my negative. I cross out my other negative for the 8. And the only thing I have left is the positive nose, so it's going to be positive 48. So that's another way you can do it. Here we have 6 times a negative 2. Well, this time I used up a positive, the nose. I used up one negative I, so I have a negative 12 as my answer, times a negative 3. Well, again, a negative times a negative will give you a positive 36. Okay, turns out that since multiplication and division are inverse operations, the rules will still carry through. They are the same. Even though they're inverse operations, the rules seem to carry through, okay? So whenever you multiply or divide, you can use the same strategies. It's the same thing going on with each of the rules. So a negative divided by a positive is going to be the same thing as a negative times a positive, which we know is a negative, and that's negative 6. Negative divided by negative is going to give us a positive here, it'll be a positive 4. Okay, then lastly we have negative 5 squared. So remember that means negative 5 times negative 5. Well, that's simply a negative times a negative, which is a positive 25. Here we have negative 5 cubed, so we can think about that as being negative 5 times negative 5 times negative 5. Remember, that's how many times this base is a factor. So negative 5 times negative 5 was our positive 25 times a negative 5. Again, we have a negative times a positive. That's going to equal a negative 125. Okay? We'll do